Compassion and resentment, they're actually incompatible. You can't experience both at the same time. So if you try to be more compassionate, you won't be resentful. The behavioral term for it is incompatible response strategy. The brain can't do incompatible things at the same time. And or we try to get people to see they like themselves better when they're compassionate to loved ones than when they're resentful, angry, and certainly abusive.
This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Welcome back to Conversation Balloons. I'm delighted to have returning Dr. Stephen Stosny. He has been a professor at University of Maryland and St. Mary's College of Maryland and written several books on relationships, one of which we're going to talk about today. You can also check out his blog on Psychology Today online. And his writing about marriage and relationships has been more helpful to me than really any other source through the years, both in applying it to my marriage and to understanding people. Even if you're not married, you can get a tremendous amount of understanding of people and how to relate successfully through reading his books, such as How to Improve Your Marriage Without Talking About It, um, and Empowered Love, Living and Loving After Betrayal, Treating Attachment Abuse. And today we're going to be talking about the principles he talks about in You Don't Have to Take It Anymore, which deals with abuse, anger, and resentment. Dr. Stasi, thank you so much for coming back.
It's my pleasure. But let me say, You Don't Have to Take It Anymore is the hardbound title. They changed the title of it when they brought it out in
Oh,
paperback, which is much less expensive. That's Love Without
okay.
Hurt is the paperback.
Well, thanks for tipping me off to that. Well, you are the founder of Compassion Power in Washington, D.C. What does that organization do?
Well, now since I'm an old man, it's mostly just me writing and doing podcasts, and I see a few clients.
Uh-huh.
Um, but we developed treatment for domestic violence and emotional abuse, and that's used worldwide now.
That's great. I saw that your books have been translated.
Yeah, and the foundation is you feel more powerful when you're compassionate than when you're angry, because anger is most likely going to make you act
Mm,
against your best interests, where you're far more likely to act in your best interests
wow.
when you're compassionate.
Could you share the story of how you, as a young man, talking with your mother, hit upon that concept of compassion?
Yeah, she really turned me on to it because my mother was a victim of severe domestic violence. She got beat up almost every weekend. We had the police to our house. In fact, when I became a researcher, the FBI database has a list of how many times police deliver uh, or how many
Hmm.
times they visited a house. So this is a confession because this wasn't ethical. I had access to that database for the research I was doing, and I put in the address that I grew up with, which you're not supposed to
Uh-huh.
use it for personal use. But we were in the 99 percentile, which means 99% of the houses in America had fewer
Oh,
police visits than the house I grew up in.
and you were
So
victimized too, right?
it had a
You
she had a happy life. She had a happy life after that. She left. I was 11 when she left my father.
and you were injured as well by this man.
Yeah, but not as much. Not the psychological injury is watching her get hit more than. I had a tooth knocked out, but that was. I don't think about that. I think about her. Um, so when I started researching, the view of domestic violence then was power and control. These men are into power and control, and that sounded intuitively right. And I asked her about it, and she said that, well, if you love somebody, you are going to try to control them. You love your husband. If he goes out in January in New England without a coat, you're going to try to control his behavior, right? If you
Mm,
don't think you're controlling, ask your children.
mm,
You love someone, you have a motivation to control them for their best interests, is what you tell them, but that's controlling. She says the problem is they're not compassionate. They don't see how they're hurting other people.
mm,
Find out why they're not compassionate, and you've got something. So
mhm,
that's what put me onto it. And the reason they're not compassionate is because they see there's two ways to deal with emotional or physical discomfort. One is to blame it on someone, and that produces anger or resentment. And the other is to try to improve or to try to connect. Those are ways that alleviate discomfort. And abusers get into the habit of blaming. I feel bad and it's your fault. And that creates resentment. And most problem anger it rests on a sea of resentment. Anger
mm,
without resentment is usually not a problem. You
mm,
just get angry at something bad that happened and it goes away in a few minutes. You don't think about it all day. It's when it's resentful, when you have this bedrock of resentment, that it goes on and on.
mhm,
And compassion and resentment they're actually incompatible. You can't experience both at the same time. So if you try to be more compassionate, you won't be resentful.
mhm,
And that's what the treatment's based on. The behavioral term for it is incompatible response strategy. The brain can't do incompatible things at the same time.
mhm,
And or we try to get people to see they like themselves better when they're compassionate to loved ones than when they're resentful, angry, and certainly abusive.
mhm,
I was in, I worked in that field for like 15 years before I started really developing this new treatment. I never met an abuser who was proud of himself for hurting someone he loved. He
mm,
could justify it. She had it coming and all of that. But, well, do you really like yourself when you do that? And universally, they said no.
mm.
So you've got to really change someone. You got to appeal to their own basic values. You can't get them to try to conform to your values. You have to appeal to their own.
And what values do they find within themselves that then can operate to bring out compassion? What would be some that they would find?
Well, the core values that I think we're born with, and they're around attachment, are compassion. Newborns will show distress if their caregivers are distressed.
Mm,
That's biological sub. No, they don't have the cognitive part of it. They don't know why you're distressed, but they get distressed when you are. The
mhm,
emotional human is the biological basis of compassion. So it's compassion, trust, love, and affection. Those we're
mhm,
born with those capacities. Those are the basic, and I believe our whole moral system evolves from that.
mhm,
The universal morality is care is good, harm is bad.
mhm,
You know, every culture has been studied. That's the fundamental part of morality. If they have morality at all, care is
mhm,
good, harm is bad, and that I think we're born with.
mhm. Is
So
that what
that's
you
the value
you
that
talk about
do you,
basic humanity, right? Is that what you
yeah,
mean by basic
and
humanity?
that is interest in the well-being of other people. And you when you really exercise your basic humanity, you get a sense that a little bit of each of us is in all of us,
Mm,
and a
mm,
little bit of all of us is in each of us.
mm,
And then you don't have the isolation. you realize that what you do to other people affects you. If you hurt someone, Socrates said that if you hurt someone else, you're hurting yourself.
Mhm.
Uh, and that is, I think, the basic humanity connection.
You talk about and
Especially
go ahead.
that's appealing to people, especially abusers have a fragile sense of self. See, we
Mm,
think of them as being narcissistic and egotistical, but they're really very fragile, which is why they get angry so often. They suffer a lot of narcissistic injury. They
mhm,
take almost everything personally.
mhm.
Change in the weather makes them angry.
You talked in our previous episode, it's called "Say Less," and everybody should go back and listen to that one too, but that men are, have a prime vulnerability that's very deep to shame, and that shame drains a person of energy, but that anger and aggression have an analgesic and adrenaline boost that actually help them feel better and more alive, at least for a short time. I had
Yeah.
never heard of that phenomenon before.
Yeah, it's really a hormonal connection between feeling in a devalued state and feeling more confident. Anger gives you temporary confidence. You know you're right when you're angry. Now, you're not angry because you're right. You feel right because you're angry.
Mm,
But it's very hard to see that while you're angry. You got to calm down to be able to see,
mhm,
maybe I shouldn't have grounded the kid till he's 42. Maybe I shouldn't have turned off the lamp with a rock. But while you're angry, that's the right thing to do.
mhm.
Uh, so it's really the trying to deal with the feeling of powerlessness. Now, I don't think that men experience shame that much because they spend so much emotional energy trying to avoid it. And the easiest way to avoid it is through the adrenaline emotions, anger, risky behavior, um,
Distraction, you talk
just,
about,
yeah,
like
intense
playing
distraction,
video games.
or it's video games, things that give you intense focus.
Mhm.
It's the
You say that
intensity that makes them feel less shame.
mm, you say the more vulnerability you have, the more threat you perceive, which
Right,
makes a lot of things make sense, and it explains why, this great, big, aggressive man actually goes around feeling like a victim.
right. Uh, well, now there's a cultural reward for feeling like a victim, but
Yeah.
when we wrote that book, there wasn't. But that's true in the animal world too. The connection between vulnerability and anger, or which is a perception of threat, is that the most ferocious animals are starving or wounded because they're more vulnerable. So they need more adrenaline, more aggression.
Huh, you sure? You talk a lot in the book, about, abusers about those who are in an abusive family having to walk on eggshells all the time, and I'm sure you knew that very well from your childhood. But also, the surprising thing is you say abusers also feel like they're walking on eggshells. How is that?
It's because they're always afraid of losing control of their emotions. They're actually afraid of their anger, although they indulge it a lot. They're afraid of it because they know it can get it really out of hand. So
Mm,
they are
yeah.
trying to avoid it too. And what the mistake they make, they think a chronic resentment will help them not to explode in anger, but it actually makes it more likely that they will because, uh, see, anger is an arousal cycle. You start at baseline, then you go up until you get up to a certain point, it gets very destructive. But there's a lot of flashpoints on the way up. But with resentment, you're not starting at baseline. You're about 30% aroused at all times. So it doesn't take much more stimulus to get up that high. So they're more likely to to get destructive anger with a bedrock of resentment.
Yeah. Um, you say that the abuser often says, "Well, I just never know when she's gonna push my buttons."
Right.
And so really someone else outside of them is in control of their emotions.
Oh, that see, that's the swindle of blame. Blame puts somebody else in control of your emotions.
Mhm,
So even though you get a little bit of adrenaline when you blame somebody for someone, you're making yourself feel powerless.
mhm.
So as soon as the adrenaline wears off, you're gonna get depressed.
You talk about this, simmering resentment, of the belief that everyone is unfair, and I loved it when you said the unfairness in the abuser's mind is, "Someone is making me feel something that I can't handle." And, as a
Yeah.
child, the child's distresses were punished or ignored, and so he felt unworthy and powerless over his emotions, and, so he doesn't want to feel something he can't handle, because when he was a child, that led to rejection, abandonment, or, punishment in his view and his experience.
But that
And
keeps them
so there
locked.
was no core value built of
Right.
I think you're meaning valuing himself. He didn't feel like he had value. Is
Yeah,
that right?
core value is valuing yourself and others simultaneously because you can't really value yourself if you're not valuing other people.
Okay. I'm taking notes. I'm still taking
Alright.
notes. I mean, I took all these notes. I've written all over your books. But
But
it's just
the trap that
so great.
abusers trap themselves in is that they will feel more powerless by trying to control their environment. See, they can't regulate the emotion internally, so they want to control their environment so it doesn't stimulate the emotions. But nobody can do that. Our
Mhm.
brains did not evolve to control our environment. They
Oh.
evolved to regulate our own bodily functions.
Hmm.
So it's a no-win proposition, and plus people are going to object to people in your environment aren't gonna wanna feel controlled, so you're gonna get a lot of negative feedback for it.
Mhm.
But it's much easier to regulate shame than to blame it on someone and then try to control the people you think are stimulating it,
How does, someone regulate shame?
by getting in touch with their core value.
Okay.
See, shame is it's a painful experience of the self as failing or inadequate or defective. But when you're in this state of core value, you know that you're valuable because you can be compassionate, kind, loving,
Mhm.
and then you don't feel like a failure.
Uh-huh.
But you
Um,
can only do that within yourself. Somebody else can't make you feel love worthy of love. They can make you feel loved. But if you don't feel worthy of love, it actually feels bad to feel loved because you're getting something you don't deserve and
mhm.
something you don't think you can return.
And
Because
you know that you can't live up to it if you
right,
think you
makes you
had
feel more
earned it.
inadequate to be
And so you're
loved,
gonna lose it tomorrow even if you have it today. It can't
right,
possibly last.
right,
And
you
then you're vigilant for any signs that they're not loving you.
right, feeling lovable is based on what you do, not on what other people do. Feeling worthy of love.
Mhm.
Other people can make you feel loved, but that's not good enough if you don't feel worthy of love.
Huh.
And the
You
only
know
way to feel worthy of love is to be compassionate, kind, and loving. It's not rocket science. If you
Mhm,
want to feel lovable, you got to be loving.
mhm.
You're never going to feel lovable but being resentful.
And in this book, you're thinking not only of abuse between, spousal abuse, but, uh, intimate partner abuse, but also, abuse of children, and you say that
And
parents
parent,
feel
any
inadequate when children cry. and
Yeah.
that's the main occasion of abuse, is not being able to get kids to stop crying. That abusers punish kids for making them feel bad about themselves.
Yeah, making you feel like a failure as a parent. Um, Most of our anger at our children is because they're reminding us that we're not doing as good a job as we'd like to as a parent. And that's not a bad feeling because it motivates you to do a better job. All right, I'm going to have to teach this kid a little bit better because he's not getting it. But
Mhm.
if you get angry at him, you just want to punish him. And that the best you're going to get with that is teach him to avoid punishment, and he'll become sneaky then.
Mm,
You don't teach people right from wrong with punishment. You teach them to avoid punishment.
mm.
You teach them right from wrong by modeling right,
Wow.
and you see that you're more successful when you're right. When you
Could you
model right from wrong, you're also modeling that you're more successful when you're doing right. When
Mhm,
you're doing wrong, you're not going to be successful, not for long.
mhm. You say that, when given a compassionate parenting course, abusers of intimate partners quit abusing their partners. How
Yeah,
how did
that
that
was
happen?
a surprise we found. We developed a compassionate parenting course based on which is now free on our, website, by the way, compassionpower.com. Um, and a lot of abusers are court ordered to take some kind of parenting course. And what if a lot of them were also in our domestic violence course, but a lot of them were not too. And the ones that were not, who took the parenting course, stopped abusing their partners because it's expanding that you like yourself better when you're compassionate to loved ones than when you're angry at them. And
Mhm,
if you want to like yourself better, you've got to do things that'll make you like yourself and avoid things that'll make you not like yourself. It's
mhm,
very simple, really, if you just look at see, emotions are simple if you look at their function. They're complex when you think about feelings because feelings are attached to a lot of different life experiences. But the basic evolved function of the emotions, they're all preparing you to approach, avoid, or attack one of
mm,
those. And
mm,
that's a lot simpler. So I can be angry at you, but do I really want to attack you? No, that's not what I want to do. So when you put it through what the evolved function of the emotion is, it's lots easier to control.
mhm. Yeah, my mother-in-law and I taught, some court-ordered parenting classes, and I'm remembering that those people were in those classes, A, because they had abused a child, but B, they wanted the child back. Presumably, there were people who had abused a child but didn't want the child back, but it was always interesting to me that they were willing to work so hard to get a child back that they had hurt so much. But
Yeah,
it
most abusers love their victims. Uh,
Mhm,
it's not the problem. Love's not the problem. It's failure of compassion. Love without compassion is possessive, controlling, and dangerous.
mhm,
Because if you're not compassionate, the moment you do something that makes me feel bad, I'm going to punish you. But if I'm compassionate, I'm saying you're doing that because you're feeling bad.
mhm,
And I'm going to be invested in trying to make you feel better so that I can feel better. So love without compassion is almost inevitably going to lead to abuse
mm.
of
Now,
some
you
kind.
we talked in our previous episode and in your book, how how to improve your marriage without talking about it, uh, about the differences between men and women, that it goes way back to women having a basic vulnerability to fear, mostly fear of isolation, men having, this, vulnerability to shame, which they try to hide, makes them
The,
try to
the
hide and
most
stonewall.
dread of failure.
But,
Anything that,
my
and
question is, do you, in compassionate parenting, are those gender differences in vulnerabilities significant, or are there basic vulnerabilities that the parent addresses in both their boys and girls?
Well, once we see the initial focus is on self-regulation, so they're not blaming their children for how they're feeling. And once we do that, we see the big conflict between parents is between nurturing and performance. And testosterone drives performance, estrogen drives nurturing. Now, children need both. They shouldn't be in competition. You should discipline in a nurturing way.
Mhm,
And you should nurture with a certain amount of discipline because that helps the children become more self-sufficient as they mature. So they we try to find a way to integrate those. Your children need both. They won't do well with one or the other. They need both.
mm.
So we've got a lot of spoiled adults now because 20 years ago we were emphasizing nurturing too much and not
Uh-huh,
performance enough.
uh-huh,
So we've got a lot of narcissistic adults because they were never taught that you have to be aware of the effects of your behavior in other people.
mhm.
When you're too nurturing, they don't get that. It's just how you feel that matters. It's not how other people feel.
That leads me to wanna know, are you seeing other differences as you've gone through your career, in the kinds of problems and kinds of things that work with these patient populations?
Well, there's a general cultural difference. It's kind of depressing for me because, 30 years ago, when I first developed this treatment, I had visions of the world becoming less angry. And of course, the world's a lot
Oh,
more angry now than it was 30 years ago. No, I should have been able to predict that because anger is the most contagious emotions. So if you're around an angry or resentful person, you're going to get resentful or angry. Fear is also very contagious, but anger, because it has more adrenaline, is more contagious. So it develops exponentially. And then when you had social media spreading it 24/7 in insidious ways that I couldn't predict social media, of course, but it is discouraging. It's an angrier world and it's a more narcissistic. See, anger makes you narcissistic. Everybody is narcissistic while they're angry. You can't
mm,
see any other perspective. You're right, everybody else is wrong. Anger also oversimplifies. So you're taking complex issues and making them very simple.
mhm.
And when you oversimplify, of course, you're losing a lot of important information.
Yes, absolutely. Well, is there a final thought you'd like to share with my audience, um, on what you've learned and what's working with angry, abusive people?
Well, I urge people not to think about abusive people. Think about resentment because everybody has a certain amount of resentment, and abusive people just carry that to extreme. And you'll get more self value out of regulating your own resentment. And the key to that is think of what makes you like yourself better, resentment or compassion. The other thing about that is resentment carries an impulse to justify it. When you're resentful, you always have to give reasons of why you're resentful, but you never have to justify compassion.
Hmm.
Go into work and say, I know what came over me last night. I took my partner's perspective. I understood where she was coming from. I sympathized with. It wasn't the real me. She pushed all my buttons. You don't justify a feeling that's good for you. You justify a feeling that's bad for you. So just the urge to justify tells you that your resentment is not good for you.
You're building a case all the time against the person, yeah. Oh, well, that's very helpful, as everything that you have said is. Thank you, Stephen, and where can our listeners find you to learn?
CompassionPower.com. There's a lot of free stuff there and some stuff to buy.
All right. Both for our listeners. Thank you very much. And everybody, I want to thank my producer, Caleb Broker, once again, does a great job. And go look for Dr. Stephen Stosny, and I hope you'll profit from his wisdom as I have. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LeahFarish.